pretty rough, but I've read and been told, or rather asked questions concerning gang wars. And
If he were still alive, and he said it again, I'd do the same all over. That's how deep the feelings ran. For years, whispers about Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley floated through Hollywood like smoke. Their relationship was clouded in tension, or so fans believed. Rumors painted them as rivals, the king of swing versus the king of rock. But Sinatra stayed mostly silent, until the day after Elvis Presley's death, when he stunned a live audience with a tribute that cracked his cool, composed exterior. What he revealed that night shattered expectations and finally gave the world a glimpse of what really lay beneath decades of mystery. This is the night Sinatra broke his silence, and what he really thought of Elvis. In the late 1950s, American music was erupting into something raw and electric. Radios exploded with rebellious sounds. Teenagers danced like they were shaking off generations of control. The polished world of big band swing and smooth jazz was fading fast. At the center of that old world stood Frank Sinatra. Sharp suit, whiskey in hand, crooning like a man who had mastered the very idea of romance. For over a decade, he was America's golden standard. He wasn't just a performer. He was the definition of class. Sold-out concerts, blockbuster films, political connections, he had it all. Then came a storm named Elvis. By 1956, Elvis Presley didn't just arrive, he detonated. With that smirk, slick hair, and a swagger that seemed almost defiant, he changed the rules. He didn't perform, he ignited. Teenagers screamed, parents gasped. And yet, the charts backed him. He was unstoppable. By the next year, Elvis wasn't a rising star. He was the sky itself. His image covered magazines, his voice ruled jukeboxes, and his southern blend of rock, gospel, and rebellion didn't just make waves, it changed the tides. The contrast was cinematic. Sinatra, all elegance and restraint, dressed in timeless tuxedos, sipped cocktails under nightclub chandeliers. Elvis? He strutted in glittering jumpsuits, hip-thrusted across TV screens, and made audiences lose their minds. Where Frank charmed, Elvis jolted, and America noticed. You couldn't avoid the looming question: was the crown slipping from Sinatra's head? The media fed the flames. Headlines cast them as adversaries in a generational battle. The old guard versus the new. It wasn't just music. It was a struggle over identity. What kind of America were we becoming? To some, Elvis was an earthquake. To others, a revelation. And to Sinatra's fans, he was an alarming shift in taste. Too wild, too raw, too fast. Meanwhile, inside recording studios and boardrooms, the power structures of the industry were reshuffling. Executives who once worshipped crooners were chasing guitar-slinging rebels. The money followed the movement. Labels rebranded, radio stations flipped formats, and nightclubs began catering to younger, louder crowds. Rock and roll wasn't a passing phase. It was the future. And so, the unspoken tension grew. What did Sinatra really think about the boy from Tupelo stealing the spotlight? Had anyone ever risen this fast? Even Frank hadn't seen a rise like this. The two men never exchanged public insults, but the silence said plenty. Until Sinatra finally spoke. In 1957, Sinatra penned a brutal takedown of rock and roll in a French magazine. He didn't name names, but the target was clear. He called the new sound a vicious, degenerate form of musical expression. A rancid aphrodisiac, he claimed, manufactured by those lacking any real musical discipline. The comments weren't just a critique, they were a dagger. Fans of Elvis felt the sting. Why would a legend punch down like this? Was it fear? Envy? Or just frustration with a world slipping out of his hands? The press erupted. Headlines accused Sinatra of waging a silent war against Elvis. The idea that the voice of elegance saw rock and roll as vulgar only deepened the divide. And yet, it wasn't just Sinatra. Many from his era saw Elvis as more than a singer. They saw him as a threat to tradition itself. He wasn't just changing music, he was changing the rules. And that terrified people. Still, Sinatra's comments didn't vanish. They stuck. They added tension to a cultural tug-of-war already in full swing. Fans didn't just see Sinatra and Elvis as two stars. They became symbols of two Americas. One rooted in grace and restraint. The other wild, free, and unapologetic. And just like that, the stage was set. Not for a duel, but for a transformation neither man saw coming. But here's where the story begins to twist. Because while the press painted a feud, and the public believed in a rivalry, reality was more complex. Sinatra wasn't finished, and neither was his opinion. By 1960, Elvis had returned from military service to a country still obsessed with him. And though the music scene had evolved, both men were still giants. Sinatra had adapted, starring in films, running his own label, and keeping his power intact. But even he could feel it. The world had changed. And despite past criticism, he wasn't immune to that change. What few knew at the time was that behind Sinatra's words was something more layered. A mix of respect, fear, and perhaps even awe. Because while he once dismissed rock and roll, Sinatra couldn't ignore what Elvis had built. Not just fame, but movement. And deep down, he understood what it meant to watch the world move on without asking for permission. And just when the spotlight seemed to be shifting elsewhere, a surprising twist unfolded. One that even longtime fans couldn't have predicted. Frank Sinatra, the same man who once dismissed rock and roll as a fad, extended an olive branch that stunned the entertainment world. Elvis Presley, fresh from his army stint, was invited to perform on Sinatra's primetime television event. This wasn't just any program. The Frank Sinatra Timex special, airing May 12, 1960, was a glittering homecoming celebration titled Welcome Home Elvis. And suddenly, the two most powerful names in American music were sharing a stage, shoulder to shoulder. It was the kind of moment that made viewers freeze. Elvis and Sinatra laughing, nodding, performing each other's songs with surprising ease. Sinatra took a breath and crooned the tender strains of Love Me Tender, while Elvis responded with a charismatic rendition of Witchcraft. The visuals were iconic, the symbolism loud and clear. Two worlds, old-school crooners and rebellious rockers, seemed to meet at a crossroad. On screen, they were all smiles. But behind the curtain, not everything was as harmonious as it seemed. Despite the headlines proclaiming peace between the legends, murmurs of discontent started to bubble under the surface. Sinatra's entourage had been cautious from the start. Whispers from insiders hinted at creative control disputes, promotional drama, and, more bluntly, a bruised ego. Elvis was paid a jaw-dropping $125,000 for his appearance, a figure that towered over what Sinatra was taking home. That discrepancy didn't sit well, especially with someone so accustomed to being the main attraction. Meanwhile, Elvis's inner circle, the fiercely loyal Memphis Mafia, watched with narrowed eyes. To them, Sinatra's sudden warmth wasn't fooling anyone. It felt calculated, like a branding move rather than an authentic change of heart. They believed Frank saw the future, and it wore blue suede shoes. Better to bring Elvis on your show than be left behind by him. Even Elvis, ever the gentleman in public, held back a bit. He respected Sinatra's status, sure. But memories lingered. he hadn't forgotten the scathing critiques or the mockery. And while he played along gracefully, there was a caution to his presence, a sense of self-protection. What the cameras caught was polished and rehearsed. But sharp eyes noticed it. The slightly too long smiles, the careful pacing, the almost theatrical camaraderie. It looked like peace, but it felt like performance. In the days that followed the broadcast, glowing reviews flooded in. Critics called it a generational handshake, a symbolic passing of the torch. But behind studio doors, stories began to leak. The men barely spoke once the cameras stopped rolling. Sinatra's team reportedly bristled at how the event had been framed. More of an Elvis celebration than a Frank special. And those closest to Elvis quietly shared that he'd felt used, like a necessary piece in someone else's puzzle. Still, the show became a legendary moment in pop culture. On paper, it was a truce. In reality, it was a balancing act. Both stars walked away with applause and good press, but the shadows of rivalry never quite disappeared. The harmony was strategic, the unity brief. And for years after, fans debated what really happened behind the glitz. Then, years later, the story took a heartbreaking turn. August 16, 1977. A date burned into history. Elvis Presley, just 42, was discovered unresponsive at his Graceland estate. The world spun off its axis. Fans couldn't process it. One moment, he was the king, larger than life. The next, silence. Lines formed outside Graceland before the news was even confirmed. Radio DJs choked back emotion. News anchors stumbled through their scripts. How could Elvis be gone? The truth was, behind the rhinestones and the bravado, there had been growing concern. His weight shifted dramatically. His stage presence wavered. There were hushed conversations about exhaustion and isolation, but he was still Elvis. People thought he'd bounce back. He always did. That's what made the shock so absolute. Grief swept the country in waves. Streets filled with fans lighting candles, clinging to transistor radios playing "Can't Help Falling in Love." He said nothing. Not in those first hours, not even in the first day. For a man whose voice once narrated generations, that silence was deafening. People wondered, was it grief or pride? Had the wounds of the past run too deep? The press filled the vacuum with speculation. Talk shows dissected their relationship. Tabloids ran wild. Some claimed Frank felt nothing. Others said he was devastated. But no one knew for sure. Behind closed doors, however, Sinatra wasn't composed. Those closest to him described a rare stillness. No bravado, no sharp one-liners, just Frank, quietly absorbing the loss. He poured himself a drink, sat with the news, and said very little. That kind of silence, especially from someone who rarely held back, spoke louder than any tribute. But the world wasn't done asking. They wanted a moment, a gesture, some acknowledgement from one titan to another. A few believed Sinatra might simply let it pass, that the complexity of their past made a clean tribute impossible. But then, something remarkable happened. Just one night later, August 17, 1977, Sinatra took the stage at Alpine Valley Music Theater. The crowd buzzed, not quite sure what to expect. And then, midway through the set, he paused. The music softened. The spotlight tightened. He looked out into the dark and spoke 5 quiet, shattering words. "There's been a death in the family." The room held its breath. Then he continued. "Elvis Presley was one of the sweetest, kindest, most decent men I've ever known. No flair, no showmanship, just truth." The crowd was silent. Some wept, others gasped. In a single moment, Sinatra did what no headline could. He pulled back the curtain on a rivalry that had always been more complicated than it appeared. He didn't recite a prepared statement. He didn't spin a legacy. He spoke from a place of real loss, and that vulnerability pierced through the years of rumors and tension. That night, Frank Sinatra honored not the legend, but the man. Elvis, the human being behind the icon. And in doing so, he revealed a side of himself most had never seen. It wasn't just that Elvis had passed. It was that Frank Sinatra, who rarely showed vulnerability, finally opened his heart, not in front of cameras, but on a quiet stage with thousands listening. His tribute wasn't scripted or staged. It was raw, honest. Just one titan acknowledging another, not with fanfare, but with quiet reverence. And that simple moment reframed everything we thought we knew about their relationship. For years, gossip painted them as rivals, old Hollywood crooner versus rebellious rock god. But 5 words from Frank changed the story forever. When Sinatra stepped off that Alpine Valley stage, something in the air had shifted. Fans didn't just remember the songs, they remembered the silence before Frank spoke. The weight of it. His voice cracked ever so slightly. And in that brief pause, an entire history unraveled. One of admiration hidden behind showbiz politics, of private respect kept far from headlines. For decades, people assumed they stood on opposite sides of fame. But that night, a veil lifted. Not just about music, but about the men behind it. Sinatra had kept his feelings close for years, dodging questions, letting others speculate. And Elvis? He played the part of the polite Southern boy, rarely speaking out against peers, even when mocked. But deep down, there was always a current of mutual regard. Elvis admired Frank's ability to control his image, his business, and his independence. Sinatra, in turn, saw past the glitter and sideburns and into the heart of a young man overwhelmed by fame and fiercely devoted to his people. They didn't party together. They weren't regulars at the same Hollywood hotspots. But there was a subtle, unspoken connection whenever they crossed paths. When Elvis returned from the army and appeared on Frank's special, it wasn't just a ratings stunt. It was a calculated peace offering, a handshake across generations. And despite quiet power struggles behind the scenes, what aired on TV felt authentic. That mutual nod of respect? It lingered. Years later, that respect only grew. Friends close to Frank said he was moved by how Elvis treated his inner circle, how loyal he remained to his team, the Memphis Mafia, and how generous he was with family and strangers alike. For Sinatra, who built a legacy on protecting those he loved, that mattered. Fame had taken its toll on both men, but they each carried their burdens with a kind of grace the world rarely acknowledged. The media loved to pit them against each other, but they missed the real story, a quiet kinship formed not by time spent, but by understanding. And when Sinatra finally broke his silence after Elvis's death, it wasn't flashy or long-winded. It was simple and devastating. A few lines, spoken softly. But in those words was a truth fans had long suspected but never quite confirmed. They weren't adversaries. They were reflections of each other, flawed, famous, and deeply human. And while Frank went on to live another 2 decades, that single tribute remained one of his most talked about moments. Not because it was grand, but because it was real. It peeled back layers of image, ego, and illusion. And for the first time, audiences saw not 2 opposing forces, but 2 legends who truly saw each other. It's these kinds of moments, unscripted, honest, and vulnerable, that remind us why we care so deeply about the stars we follow. But as we shift from memory to modern day, Another recent Hollywood moment has shaken fans to the core. This time, it wasn't about legacy. It was about a shocking revelation from a current star whose reputation seemed unshakable. In a surprise turn, beloved actor and entrepreneur Matthew Vaughn revealed a hidden chapter of his past. While promoting his latest directorial project, Vaughn opened up about a major identity twist, admitting after years of speculation that he is not, in fact, the son of actor Robert Vaughn, as long believed. "It's something I carried with me for years," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "But it's time the truth came out." The confession left fans stunned. For decades, tabloids had speculated about the father-son connection, but Vaughn had remained silent. Until now. This moment wasn't about scandal. It was about shedding a lie that had followed him his entire career. It's a rare thing in Hollywood, where image is everything, for someone to expose a false narrative and reclaim their story. And while some questioned the timing, most saw it for what it was, a brave step toward authenticity. Elsewhere in the industry, a darker cloud hovered. News broke that actress Shirley Douglas, daughter of screen legend Kirk Douglas, had passed unexpectedly. Though she never reached the global fame of her father, Shirley left a legacy of activism, theater, and resilience. Friends remember her not for fame, but for her fierce advocacy for civil rights and health care. Her passing reminds us that fame is fleeting, but impact, when rooted in purpose, endures. Back in the spotlight, as tributes for Elvis resurfaced and Vaughn's revelation made headlines, fans began to reflect on how these stories, past and present, intertwine. They all pull back the curtain on celebrity, exposing the people beneath the polish. It's why Sinatra's final words about Elvis still echo. Because they were never about performance. They were about truth. And when we examine Elvis Presley's extraordinary lifestyle, the numbers tell their own story. At his peak, he owned a fleet of luxury cars, including a 1960 Rolls-Royce Phantom Vive, multiple Cadillacs, and even a Stutz Blackhawk. He wore custom-made Omega watches and favored gold-accented timepieces. His Graceland estate, now a historic landmark, was just one of several properties, and he famously traveled in his own Convair 880 jet, nicknamed the Lisa Marie. Financially, Elvis invested in music publishing, film production, and merchandising, with early deals that set the blueprint for future artists. He was protected by hefty insurance policies that covered his tours, health, and prized possessions. His life was a lesson in empire building, but also in the costs of fame. The takeaway? Build smart, protect assets, but never lose sight of health and balance. In the end, legacies are defined not by numbers, but by the moments people remember. The vulnerable pauses, the honest confessions, the quiet tributes. Sinatra gave us one of those. Vaughn just added his own, and Elvis, even in silence, continues to shape how we see greatness. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. From secret truths to heartfelt tributes, Hollywood never stops surprising us. Hit like, drop your thoughts below, and subscribe for more deep dives. Remember, legends fade, but their echoes remain.